Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Joe paced nervously around his bedroom. His mother's suitcase stood packed and ready by the front door, a silent reminder of her imminent departure. In just a few short hours, she'd be on a plane headed across the country to visit his ailing grandmother. Joe's heart raced as he contemplated the weekend ahead. At 20, with his mother gone, he finally had the opportunity he'd been waiting for. His palms grew clammy as he reached for the shoebox hidden beneath his bed, carefully sliding it out into the open. "This is it," he whispered to himself, fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside lay an assortment of cosmetics, carefully collected over the past few months. Lipsticks, eyeshadows, foundation, all in shades matching his mother's complexion. Joe had spent hours studying her routines, watching YouTube tutorials, and practicing in secret. Now was his chance to put it all to the test. The sound of car keys jangling downstairs jolted Joe from his thoughts. He quickly shoved the box back under the bed and hurried to the top of the stairs. "Joe, I'm heading out now, sweetie." "Coming, Mom," he called back, taking the steps 2 at a time. His mother stood by the door, overnight bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled warmly as Joe approached, pulling him into a tight hug. "Now, you're sure you'll be all right on your own this weekend?" she asked, brow furrowed with concern. "There's plenty of food in the fridge, and Mrs. Johnson next door said to call if you need anything." Joe nodded, forcing what he hoped was a casual smile. "I'll be fine, Mom. Don't worry about me. Just focus on Grandma, okay?" She cupped his face in her hands, studying him for a long moment. "My responsible boy. I don't know what I'd do without you." If only she knew, Joe thought, guilt twisting in his stomach. He pushed the feeling aside, determined not to let anything ruin his plans. "Have a safe flight," he said, giving her one last hug before helping her out to the waiting taxi. Joe watched from the porch as the car pulled away, his mother waving from the back seat. He waved back until the vehicle disappeared around the corner, then slowly lowered his arm. A mix of excitement and nervousness washed over him as he realized he was truly alone. Taking a deep breath, Joe headed back inside and locked the door behind him. He leaned against it for a moment, heart pounding. This was really happening. After months of planning and preparation, he was finally going to do it. Joe made his way upstairs, pausing briefly outside his mother's bedroom. He'd never entered without permission before, and even now, a twinge of guilt made him hesitate. But the urge to proceed was too strong to ignore. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside. The room smelled of his mother's perfume, a familiar floral scent that brought a lump to his throat. Joe shook off the emotion and made his way to the closet, sliding open the mirrored doors. His gaze swept over the neatly hung dresses and blouses, settling on a navy blue wrap dress his mother often wore to work. Joe reached out, fingers brushing against the soft fabric. This was the one. Carefully, he removed the dress from its hanger and laid it out on the bed. Next came a pair of nude pumps from the shoe rack, followed by a lacy bra and matching panties from the dresser. Joe's cheeks burned as he handled the delicate undergarments, but he pushed through his embarrassment. With the outfit assembled, Joe retreated to his own room to begin his transformation. He retrieved the shoebox of cosmetics and set it on his desk, arranging the contents with methodical precision. Foundation, concealer, powder, blush, eyeshadow, eyeliner, mascara, lipstick. Everything he needed to recreate his mother's polished look. Joe started with a thorough cleanse and moisturize, just as he'd seen his mother do countless times. Then came the foundation, applied in thin layers to build coverage without looking cakey. He dabbed concealer under his eyes and over any blemishes, blending carefully with a damp sponge. As he worked, Joe found himself slipping into an almost meditative state. The familiar motions, practiced in secret so many times before, came naturally now. He contoured his cheekbones and jawline, softening the masculine angles of his face. A sweep of rosy blush brought warmth to his complexion. Eyes were next. the part Joe had struggled with most during his practice sessions. He took extra care as he applied a neutral eyeshadow, building depth in the crease. With a steady hand, he traced a thin line of liquid eyeliner along his lashes, winging it out at the corners just like his mother did. Slow and steady, Joe murmured to himself as he curled his lashes and applied mascara. The transformation was already remarkable, but he knew the finishing touches would truly bring it all together. A swipe of rose-colored lipstick completed the makeup look. Joe pressed his lips together, then blotted them on a tissue just as he'd seen his mother do. He leaned back, studying his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him was undeniably his own, and yet different. Softer, more delicate. With his features enhanced and reshaped by the careful application of cosmetics, the resemblance to his mother was undeniable. "Almost there," he whispered, reaching for the navy dress. The silk-like fabric slid coolly over his skin as Joe pulled on the dress. He fumbled with the wrap style for a moment before managing to secure it properly. The hem fell just above his knees, revealing legs he'd meticulously shaved and moisturized in preparation for this moment. Stepping into the heels was the final touch. Joe wobbled slightly as he found his balance, gripping the edge of his desk for support. He'd practiced walking in his mother's shoes whenever he had the house to himself, but it was still a challenge. Taking a deep breath, Joe turned to face the mirror once more. The figure reflected back at him was startlingly familiar, yet utterly foreign. With his made-up face, curvy silhouette, and feminine attire, he could almost pass for his mother's younger sister. A thrill ran through him, equal parts excitement and terror. He'd done it, transformed himself into a reasonable facsimile of the woman who'd raised him. But now that the moment was here, Joe found himself at a loss for what to do next. He'd been so focused on the how of his plan that he hadn't given much thought to the why. What exactly did he hope to accomplish by dressing up as his mother? Joe took a tentative step forward, then another. He moved carefully at first, mindful of the unfamiliar heels. But as he paced back and forth across his bedroom, a strange sense of confidence began to build within him. With each click of the heels against the hardwood floor, Joe felt himself settling into the role he'd created. His posture straightened, shoulders rolling back as he imagined how his mother carried herself. He let his hips sway slightly with each step, mimicking the graceful gait he'd observed countless times. A wild idea seized him. Why limit this experience to his bedroom? The whole house was empty. He could explore freely, fully immersed in his new persona. Heart pounding, Joe made his way to the bedroom door. He hesitated for just a moment before turning the knob and stepping out into the hallway. The air felt cooler against his exposed legs and arms, raising goosebumps on his skin. Joe paused at the top of the stairs, gripping the banister as he considered his next move. The thought of descending in heels was daunting, but the urge to continue his adventure outweighed his fear. Carefully, he began to make his way down, one step at a time. Halfway down, a floorboard creaked loudly beneath his foot. Joe froze, irrationally certain that someone would hear despite knowing he was alone. He held his breath, listening intently for any sign of discovery. After a long moment of silence, Joe exhaled slowly and resumed his descent. He reached the bottom without incident, a small sense of triumph blooming in his chest. He was really doing this, walking around the house dressed as his mother, heels and all. Joe's gaze fell on his mother's purse, still sitting on the entryway table where she'd left it in her rush to leave. He approached it slowly, drawn by an impulse he couldn't quite name. With trembling fingers, he reached out and lifted the bag. It was heavier than he expected, the leather warm and supple against his palm. Joe slipped the strap over his shoulder, adjusting it until it sat comfortably. The weight of the purse, the click of the heels, the swish of the dress against his legs, it all combined to create a surreal sense of embodiment. For a moment, Joe could almost believe he truly was his mother. He straightened his posture, lifting his chin as he'd seen her do countless times. With careful steps, he made his way into the living room. Joe's eyes fell on the large mirror hanging above the fireplace. He approached it slowly, heart racing as he took in his reflection. The transformation was even more striking in the full-length view. From his carefully styled hair to the tips of his heels, he looked convincing. A bubbling laugh escaped him, surprising in its higher pitch. Joe clapped a hand over his mouth, shocked by the sound. He hadn't intended to alter his voice, but it seemed his body was committed to the illusion. "Well," he said softly, testing out this new feminine tone. "What shall we do now?" The house suddenly felt full of possibilities. Joe found himself moving from room to room, seeing the familiar spaces through new eyes. In the kitchen, he opened cabinets and drawers, marveling at how different everything felt when viewed from this perspective. He paused by the refrigerator, noticing a to-do list his mother had left magnetized to the door. Without really thinking about it, Joe plucked the list from its spot and slipped it into her purse. It felt like the sort of thing his mother would do, gathering up loose ends before leaving the house. That thought sparked an idea. Why limit himself to wandering the house? His mother often ran errands on Friday afternoons. If he truly wanted to experience life from her perspective, shouldn't he venture out into the world? The idea was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Joe's palms grew sweaty as he contemplated the risks. What if someone recognized him? What if he ran into one of the neighbors, or worse, one of his own friends? But the urge to push further, to fully inhabit this role he'd created, was too strong to ignore. Before he could talk himself out of it, Joe grabbed his mother's car keys from the hook by the door. He hesitated with his hand on the doorknob, suddenly aware of how exposed he'd be the moment he stepped outside. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to go back upstairs and wash off the makeup, to put everything back where he'd found it and pretend this had never happened. Instead, Joe took a deep breath and opened the door. The late afternoon sun was warm on his face as he stepped onto the porch. Joe glanced up and down the street, relieved to see it was empty. Most of the neighbors would still be at work or running their own errands. It was now or never. Joe made his way down the front walk, focusing on maintaining his balance in the unfamiliar heels. Each step felt precarious, but he forced himself to move with the confidence he'd observed in his mother. Head high, shoulders back, hips swaying subtly with each stride. He reached the car without incident, fumbling slightly with the keys as he unlocked the driver's side door. Sliding into the seat was a challenge. The dress rode up, and Joe had to tug it back into place once he was settled behind the wheel. For a long moment, he simply sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to calm his racing heart. This was madness. He should go back inside, end this charade before it went too far. But as Joe caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror, something shifted inside him. The face looking back was so convincingly feminine, so close to his mother's, that he felt a surge of confidence. He could do this. He would do this. With trembling hands, Joe started the engine and backed out of the driveway. He had no real destination in mind, but found himself heading towards the small shopping center where his mother often ran errands. It was risky. There was always the chance of running into someone they knew, but the pull was too strong to resist. As he drove, Joe found himself slipping deeper into the role he'd created. He hummed along softly to the adult contemporary station his mother favored, tapping manicured fingers against the steering wheel in time with the music. At stoplights, he checked his lipstick in the rearview mirror, pursing his lips just as he'd seen his mother do countless times. The parking lot of the shopping center was busy but not crowded when Joe arrived. He pulled into a spot near the back, away from the main flow of foot traffic. For a long moment, he simply sat there, gathering his courage. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, surprised again by the softness of his voice. "Just a quick trip inside. No one will even notice you." Taking a deep breath, Joe opened the car door and carefully swung his legs out. He stood slowly, mindful of his balance on the uneven pavement. With one last glance at his reflection in the car window, he squared his shoulders and began walking towards the stores. The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open as Joe approached, a blast of cool air washing over him. He grabbed a shopping cart more out of habit than necessity, using it to steady himself as he ventured into the brightly lit aisles. Joe had no real shopping list, but he found himself going through the motions of his mother's usual routine. He examined produce, checking for ripeness with a critical eye. In the dairy section, he compared prices on different brands of yogurt. Each action felt both foreign and familiar, as if he were playing a part in a well-rehearsed play. As he turned down the cereal aisle, a voice called out behind him. "Ellen! Ellen, is that you?" Joe froze, panic seizing his chest. Slowly, he turned to see Mrs. Abernathy, their next-door neighbor, approaching with a bright smile. His mind raced. Mrs. Abernathy was notorious for her poor eyesight. Could he possibly fool her up close? "Oh, it is you!" Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed, coming to a stop beside Joe's cart. "I thought you were leaving town this weekend to visit your mother?" Joe's heart hammered in his chest as he scrambled for a response. When he spoke, he was amazed at how naturally the higher, softer tones came to him. "Oh, Mrs. Abernathy. Yes, well, there was a bit of a delay with my flight. I thought I'd squeeze in some shopping while I wait for the new departure time." Mrs. Abernathy nodded sympathetically. "Oh, you poor dear. These airlines, I swear they're getting worse every year. Well, I hope you're not delayed too long. How's Joe holding up with you being away?" A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Joe's throat, but he managed to suppress it. "Oh, you know Joe," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "He's so responsible. I'm sure he'll be just fine on his own." "Such a good boy," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Well, I won't keep you. Have a safe trip, dear." Joe watched, heart still racing, as Mrs. Abernathy continued on her way. He'd done it. He'd actually fooled someone into believing he was his mother. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Abandoning any pretense of actually shopping, Joe made his way to the checkout lanes. He grabbed a magazine from the rack, something about home decor that he knew his mother enjoyed, and placed it on the conveyor belt. The cashier barely glanced at him as she rang up the purchase, and Joe felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment at going unnoticed. As he exited the store, Joe's confidence grew. He'd successfully navigated his first public outing in this guise. What else could he accomplish? The possibilities seemed endless. But as he approached the car, a sobering thought struck him. This wasn't real. No matter how convincing his disguise, no matter how many people he managed to fool, he would never truly be his mother. This was all just an elaborate game of pretend. Joe's hand trembled as he unlocked the car door. The euphoria of his successful outing was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. What was he really trying to prove with all of this? As he slid into the driver's seat, Joe caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at him was a stranger's. Beautiful, yes, but not his own. Not really his mother's either, despite the careful mimicry. With a shaky sigh, Joe started the engine. It was time to go home, to wash away this mask he'd created and face the reality of who he truly was. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him. This experience, as strange and potentially misguided as it was, had awakened something in Joe. A curiosity about identity, about the roles we play and the faces we present to the world. He didn't have any answers yet, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time he explored these questions. For now, though, it was time to return to reality. Joe drove home in silence, lost in thought about the events of the day and what they might mean for his future. As he pulled into the driveway, he felt a mix of relief and regret. The adventure was over, but its impact would linger long after the makeup was washed away. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.